Welcome, everybody, to Germany after Merkel, end of an era or more of the same. You have seen on the slide that's up that the hashtag of this event is LSE Germany votes, or one term. My name is Waltraud Schäkle, and I'm a political economist, a professor in political economy at the European Institute. What we want to discuss today is exciting German politics, and that seems to be a bit of an oxymoron, but there is a nail-biter of an election coming up. And the only thing we know for sure is that Angela Merkel will no longer be the chancellor afterwards anymore. She may be a caretaker for a while, but then she will be gone. And for some of you students, that must be come as a shock. The world, how you will wonder how the world looks after such a monumental change. But then we also know Scholz or Laschet are the most likely successors. So in whatever constellation of a coalition, what difference does that really make? To help us answer this question, we have invited 4 eminent experts on German politics, German economics, and much more, as you will find. There's first Dr. Ulrike Franke. She's a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She has a PhD in international relations from the University of Oxford. And at the ECFR, she is responsible for the technology and European Power Initiative. She has done a PhD on using drones by Western armies, so you can see where this linkage comes from. Then we have Dr. Christian Odendahl, an old friend of the European Institute and a regular on our panels. He's a chief economist at the Center for European Reform, a think tank that was for a long time based in London, that had a critical sympathy to the European integration process. And I mean, his research interests read like my own. So in short, it's European monetary and economic integration, but he has also Germany as an interest. His PhD is in economics from the Stockholm University. And before joining CER, Christian worked as a senior economist at Rubini Global Economics in London. Then we have Mitch Rachman, head of Europe at the Eurasia Group, which is a leading political risk consultancy. He's a graduate from the European Institute in the political economy program, and now also a senior visiting fellow with us at the European Institute. And he's an adjunct professor of Sciences Po. Some of you will see Mitch again when he teaches you political risk analysis in your professional development course. Last but not least, we have Dr. Daniela Schwarzer, who is an executive director for Europe and Eurasia at the European Society Foundation of George Soros. Before that, she was CEO of the German Council on Foreign Relations and also research director of the German Marshall Fund, and several jobs before. I think she was also once at the Financial Times Deutschland. So without further ado, I would like each of these eminent, young, fresh experts asked to answer the question that is in our events program today. Will a world after Merkel make any difference for German politics and the economy or not? I would like to ask Ulrike to start, and she is, as you have heard, an expert on security and defense policy. Perhaps she will also relate to that a bit. Ulrike, the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and a wonderful good evening to everyone. Yes, I thought I'll quickly talk about foreign and defense policy of Germany, end of an era or more of the same. And I have to admit, if you ask me like this in this kind of binary way, is it going to be an end of an era or more of the same? On foreign and defense policy, I'm going to go with more of the same. I think there's quite some continuity. This doesn't mean that there aren't some areas in which change may happen independently of who wins, and maybe more importantly, some change will depend on who wins on Sunday and which coalition will form. But so very briefly, I think the first point to really understand is that German foreign and defense policy has a long continuity, and this isn't just about 16 years of Merkel, but even before this, let's say the last 3 decades. there are certain things that kind of remain the same or are indeed priorities of most German policy makers and to some extent also the larger public. The first one would be the kind of the importance of the transatlantic alliance. This may go down a little bit at the moment, but is still there. Second, the importance of Europe and the EU. And I think this is very much, something that pretty much all all German policymakers, other than maybe the extreme left and the extreme right, subscribe to, as well as the general public. Germany as a kind of unifying force within the EU and as a important player within the EU. There's also the general idea that Germany shouldn't take on too confrontational positions with regard to other geopolitical players such as Russia and China. And the military, all things defense, all things military aren't exactly popular in Germany, neither in the general population, but also not in the political realm. Nevertheless, there's one area where I expect some movement with Merkel leaving, and this independently of who wins on Sunday. And this is Germany's relationship with regard to China. Now, to be sure, this isn't a change that's coming out of choice, but more out of necessity. Because Germany, for the longest time, thought it could kind of bring China in, as did other countries, of course, trade with China, get China to develop as a liberal democracy, and everyone would be happy. That doesn't seem to be the case, and especially the US is kind of pushing Germany and Europe to take on more of a position. So I think this will happen to some extent, and there has been some movement in the German political realm, including within the CDU and within the business community when it comes to positioning Germany a bit more clearly with regard to China. But maybe more interestingly, there are some changes that will indeed depend on who wins on Sunday. And I'm sure you all know, there are different coalitions that can form. It's all very unclear. So I'm going to generalize quite a bit here. But there are basically three topics in the realm of foreign and defense policy that I'm looking at in particular, and that I think will be treated differently under a CDU-led government versus an SPD-led government. And I'm not going to talk about any other kind of coalition versions. We can discuss this in the Q&A, but broadly speaking, either Christian Democrat-led or SPD-led. And these three issues that I think are worth kind of taking a look at is the NATO 2% commitment, Germany spending 2% of its GDP on its own defense capabilities, Germany's role in NATO's nuclear sharing, and then third, a more or less hawkish or muscular position with regard to China and possibly also Russia. And speaking, very broadly, I would say that when it comes to the NATO 2% commitment and the idea that Germany should be spending more on its own defensive capabilities, under a CDU-led government, we are likely to try and do that. Now, of course, the CDU has been in power for the last 16 years and we haven't reached the 2%, but there's a commitment to the NATO 2%. There is a commitment of spending more for the Bundeswehr. The CDU, CSU actually consider themselves the parties of the Bundeswehr. Obviously, it's rhetoric, but still important. And they would try to at least do this, and they see the military as some element of foreign policy. An SPD-led government is less likely to go down that route. The SPD hasn't made this commitment as clearly, and they will be in a coalition with the Greens, which is pretty certain. And the Greens basically reject the 2% goal and say the methodology is terrible and we need to kind of rework the whole thing. That's number one. Maybe more important is number two, nuclear sharing. As you probably know, Germany is a member of NATO's nuclear sharing, not just politically, but also militarily. So there are US nuclear weapons that are stationed on German soil, and that German aircraft should, in the situation of a crisis, carry German aircraft should be carrying these US nuclear weapons and use them. The thing is, these aircrafts are getting old. And the next government will need to make a decision on whether or not to replace these aircrafts and with what. Again, a CDU-led government is likely to just buy new aircraft and continue NATO's nuclear sharing and Germany's role within it. Don't rock the boat, despite the fact that militarily, nuclear sharing doesn't really work that well. But anyway, I think they will try this. It says in their party manifesto that they support NATO's nuclear sharing. An SPD-led government, much less certain. because, neither the SPD nor the Greens, especially not the Linke, who may be in the government with them, really support nuclear sharing and support nuclear weapons. And it would be really quite difficult for them to buy aircrafts for millions, if not billions of euro to carry nuclear weapons. So under an SPD-led government, Germany may actually leave NATO's nuclear sharing, which would be a big deal. And to finish off, the question of, Germany's positioning towards geopolitical actors, especially China, but a little bit also Russia. I think under a CDU-led government, despite the kind of general change I described overall, I think a CDU-led government will try to not take on too strong positioning towards these actors. The Russia sanctions will be continued, but they will kind of try to find a middle way. Again, not rock the boat too much, which would be different on an SPD-led government, especially again if it includes the Greens, because they have emphasized human rights issues much more and are likely to, at least rhetorically, take a stronger stance towards actors that violate human rights, such as China and Russia. The problem, of course, and this is my last sentence, is that the combination of what I said, on the one hand, taking a more hawkish or stronger position towards geopolitical actors such as China and Russia, while at the same time not exactly feeding Germany's geopolitical power by investing in the military, could be a bit of a tricky political standpoint. But I'll end here with this, kind of broad overview.
Thanks a lot, Ulrike, for your few provocative hypotheses, and I learned a lot from this. I didn't know about this nuclear sharing, I have to admit. So, Christian, can I ask you to tell us a bit of how you think the German economy within the European recovery will do and how that influences their stance on returning back to normal with, fiscal rules and all that?
Yes, absolutely. Happy to. I just wanted to add to my CV that you read out that I spent a year at LSE as a visiting PhD student and have only fond memories of that time. So very glad to be speaking at an LSE event again. My focus will be on fiscal policy and the EU recovery from the pandemic. And my verdict on sort of the question of whether we are about to witness a new era or more of the same is sort of, there is a chance for a new era, but it's not certain. Germany is known for its hawkish stance on fiscal policy, as a macro tool on inflation, on public debt. I think that's all well known. And I think we have the Eurozone policy mix to prove it. But then Angela Merkel, during this pandemic, agreed to the EU Recovery Fund, a huge European fund based on common EU debt with sizable transfers going south. So that doesn't really fit. So what's going on and what does it say about the next government? So I think there are 6 reasons for why the fiscal debate in Germany has changed. The first is sort of the empirical assessment of the last 10 years and sort of whether the policy mix that we decided to implement was the right one. I think there are increasing doubts, and this is more and more consensus, that we didn't set the right priorities. We have declining interest rates that are now negative for most of Germany's yield curve, and fast declining public debt levels up to this pandemic in Germany, so that the fear of ever increasing debt is not borne out by the facts. We have a generational change among those who shaped that debate. So young people coming up with a different in media, in policymaking, in businesses and so forth. With a different experience, not the 1990s and sort of the sick man of Europe, Germany, but Germany and Europe in the financial crisis. We have sort of, I think the pandemic brought that home, finally brought that point home, is that our infrastructure, our digitalization, our schools, our public transport, our public administration and so forth requires quite a bit of investment. And I think this has sort of shifted the priorities also of the German public away from the obsession with debt towards more concern about sort of Germany's infrastructure. But I think there are 2 more reasons which are probably the most important, and that is the shift in the geopolitical setup. During the Euro crisis, Barack Obama was president of the United States. Brexit was far away. And China was still as Ulrike said, or we could have this illusion that China was a cooperation partner and about to become democratic. So it's a sort of this whole geopolitical setup has changed and made people aware that Europe's economic strength is a political necessity, regardless of how you think about public debt. And this is surely one of the main reasons, I think, why Angela Merkel agreed, and not just agreed to the recovery fund. She was one of the driving forces of that recovery fund and put a lot of her own political capital into it. And the sixth reason is climate change, which during the Euro crisis did play some role, but nowhere near the role that it plays today in the political agenda. And it is very high up on the concerns of the German public. And so I think many more people are worried that we don't get climate change right than are worried about public debt. And so this is sort of a bunch of reasons why the public debate has changed, and that sort of opened up the political space also for Merkel to relatively safely agree on such a bold initiative like the European Recovery Fund. So what is the opening, or what is the potential new era after this election? We still have very tough fiscal rules in Germany and in Europe. And they are enshrined in the constitution and the treaties, so it's not easy to circumvent them. But I think that especially the climate angle is an important opening in that debate, because fighting climate change with carbon prices alone is politically toxic. And I think the yellow vest in France and this autumn actually with higher gas prices will bring that point home once again, that fighting climate change purely with carbon prices is politically extremely tricky. And I think conservatives will realize that they have to be a bit more flexible on their ideological stance on public debt and finances in the size of the state if they want to get this transition that they have sort of boxed themselves into through commitment and international treaties to get that right. And there are ways to do it. Right. So it's, even if, the SPD and the Greens in Germany probably would be keen on reforming the debt brake, it's clear that they can't do that because you need 2/3 majorities in both houses of parliament to do that. And there's no way we can reform the debt brake if the CDU ends up in opposition. But luckily, the German debt rule that is in the constitution is relatively easy to circumvent if you do it right and to make it climate proof. And the pandemic government, so Angela Merkel and Olaf Scholz, were smart enough to sort of build in buffers for the next years by planning their budgets for 2021 and 2022 very pessimistically, so that there is still room for the transition. It really depends on how far the Free Democrats are willing to go. So I'm just basing this on the assumption that a traffic light coalition after this government, so the SPD, the Greens, and the liberal conservative Free Democrats, it will be the outcome. It all depends on how far they are willing to go. And I think there it is a bit troubling that the FDP has given sort of balanced budget and no tax hikes such a high symbolic importance in their campaign. Because the German industry, if you think about it, the German industry has been calling for more public investment for years now, has been calling on the conservatives to rethink their obsession with debt and balanced budgets. The IMF has been doing that for even longer. And I think it's a sort of a fair rule of thumb is if you are to the conservative right of both the IMF and German industry, then you're probably a bit too far on the conservative end of the spectrum. And so this is where I hope we get a rethink. And so this is sort of my optimism that, the push from the industry will make sure that even the FDP sort of realizes that a bigger push of public investment is needed in Germany. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Christian. Bit of hope here. Before I go on, you get all a chance to put in your Q&A in personally, or I summarize it depending on how eager you are. We'll finish this round and I let briefly the speakers come back to each other, and then we open up. We have at least 45 minutes for Q&A. Daniela, the difference in geopolitical situation has now been mentioned by a few. And while I would, at some other point, I would have asked you also about Euro area reform and so on and so forth. Today, I ask you in your new post about this whole meaning of Eurasia for the German government in the EU and how it positions itself there.
Well, thank you very much, Waltraud. I very much enjoy being with you. I would say the topic of Eurasia is entirely absent from the German electoral campaigns. And the concept itself in Germany is not very often, discussed. You can either take it as a geography, or you can take it as a political notion, which is mainly spread by Russia as an area of influence and as a collection of states which share deeper economic ties and if you ask Moscow, ideally also deeper political ties. That's the Eurasian Union concept that Moscow has been putting forward. So if you admit, I would slightly if you permit me to do this, I would slightly reframe the question and ask about how does Germany look at Russia, at Russia's role in Europe's security order, and what does this mean for Germany's and Europeans' policy towards the EU's eastern neighbors. And obviously, the further east we go, the more we will also encounter China. So I will close with some remarks on China as well. Now, of course, many people have looked at almost everything that the candidates in the electoral campaign have said. And it is quite striking that the big geopolitical questions are almost entirely absent. This includes really the relationship to Russia, and as far as they can avoid, they also like to avoid the question of China. Because in my view, this is really one of the most tricky foreign policy questions for the German government going forward. For one thing, because the various iterations of readjusting Germany's Russia policy haven't really brought the success that one would have wanted. And it's very hard to imagine what else could be done that would fit the traditional toolkit of German foreign and security and defense policy that would actually change Russia's behavior. And there's little hope. So it's a very unattractive topic. But the truth of the matter is, of course, that we see that in our eastern neighborhood, at least two superpowers are expanding their influence. And that is Russia, if you take the case of Belarus, where the EU deliberately decided not to make this a geopolitical conflict, and really kept out and just supported, some governments supported the dissidents, the opposition candidates and so on, but there was no offer that the EU would have made or that Germany would have supported towards Belarus to build an alternative to its proximity with Russia. So there is a lot of caution. And I do believe that part of the reason why the big questions of foreign policy are so absent from the German electoral campaign is that we are dealing, and it's Germany and Europe from a German perspective, always together and most closely, I think, compared to other countries, that Germany and Europe in many ways are on the defensive side and basically see behavior in Russia or in China that they don't approve of. And their only way is to sanction this. But there's at the moment, no positive agenda that would actually promise a fundamental change of the situation in the relationship with Russia. And from a European perspective, at the latest, since the annexation of Crimea, there is a serious debate to be had about the European security order and whether Russia still sticks to the principles that have underpinned it until that point, which is essentially also a commitment to not changing borders with violent means. Now, the outgoing government, and in particular Chancellor Merkel, has taken an important role in the relationship with Russia for the Europeans. The most prominent format being the Normandy format, which was essentially or is essentially a meeting between the leadership of Russia, Ukraine, and then Germany and France on behalf of the Europeans to discuss a resolution of the conflict. No tangible results, but an important channel of conversation. And I'm mentioning this because this is very often the bottom line that you get when you discuss with German policymakers, how should we approach Russia? What Germany always wants to do, and I don't see a major difference in that regard among the parties who will possibly move into the chancellery, it is important to always keep the dialogue going. That is why some at this point say maybe it was a mistake to reduce the G8 format to a G7 format in reaction to the annexation of Crimea. So I expect the next German government to try and keep that dialogue with Russia open. But very frankly, the trust in the Russian government, if at all there was any in President Putin, it is, in my observation, at an all-time low since ever he took office. After even, killings of US Secret Services on German territory, the Navalny affair, and many other anecdotes, or serious events which we could line up, which have shown that there is no interest on the Russian side to actually move to a different place. But the external provocations and the external expansion of power and control over other countries' territory is really a function of the internal needs that President Putin has within Russia, and that will not substantively change. Now, there are some differences in tone when it comes to the relationship with Russia, with a number of prominent SPD politicians more or less emphasizing, the ties, the cultural base, the necessity to deal with Russia in a constructive way because it is a neighbor. And some are even apologetic with regards to those moments where Russia really violated international law, kills its own people, and so on. But most of social democrat politicians really hold a very firm line on that, though they emphasize the need for dialogue in a different way than maybe the Christian Democrats would, although they also do that, as I said. But everyone, I think, in Berlin at this point has become more realistic on Russia than it used to be. Now, what is then the policy proposal towards the Eastern neighborhood and Eurasia? I think that Germany, whoever moves into the chancellery, will continue to support European policies, in particular towards the three frontrunners of the Eastern Partnership, which is Russia, Ukraine, and Moldova, to support their closer ties with the European Union. There will be no membership perspective coming out of Berlin or Brussels as a goal. However, closer ties and, a review maybe of the Eastern Partnership Agreement and more offers in particular at the moment. Moldova is a very interesting country with a newly elected president who really, really invests a lot in fighting corruption and is a hopeful candidate for real change in the region. I think there will be bilateral investment on the German side, but also the EU. Final words, because I'm looking at time, and this is, it's a big topic, and I don't want to be too long. On Eurasia, I think the realization now in the wider sense going further east, I think the realization that is now present in the European Union is that we lost time and in a way created a vacuum because there was an interest to build closer ties with Western partners, and Russia didn't fill that vacuum, but China eventually did through major investments, also in the area of tech and digital. And so the concern of Europe is that this provides alleys of influence, not only into our Eastern neighborhood, but right into the European Union as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and in particular its digital component. So in a way, I think the new phase now, as the new German government comes in, will be a more critical perspective on what is happening in the region, seeing it under the headline of systemic conflict, which plays out very practically. For instance, when you think about standard setting and regulatory standards, when you think about the way political systems may be in a good or in a bad way underpinned by new technologies. And what we see is the increasing use of that authoritarians use technology to underpin their power. And China exports very proactively and precisely into that region. So I think the perspective on the region has really changed from being one where Europe competes with Russian influence to one where we compete with both, while China being the far more strategic and, in my view, the far more consequential for Europe as it looks at its wider neighborhood. Thank you very much.
That will be a big change then, and how Germany will react to this. Thank you, Daniela. Mitch, finally, after all these German perspectives from people who have often lived abroad, or most of the time, as it seems to be from some CVs, but still they're Germans and look, so to speak, from inside out. You're the only non-German on the panel, and I would like to ask you, what do you think are the relationships where Germany, may have to change its position, and where those from outside will hope for some change or continuity, depending how it is? I think in particular of the UK, of course, after Brexit, but also France and perhaps Italy. Could you say something on that?
Thank you, Waltraud. So yes, what I'll do in my brief remarks is look at what the transition in Germany means for Europe, both in terms of political leadership, as well as some of the nearer term policy challenges. And I think it's not an exaggeration to suggest there is some concern in Brussels, Paris and elsewhere about the vote on Sunday and some of the implications that will follow on from that vote. And I think the concerns are really threefold. One is, are we looking at weaker German leadership in Europe overall going forward? Secondly, to what extent does that feed into a broader leadership deficit that the Union will face in light of the transition we're also going to see in France in the first half of next year? And then if you think about weaker German leadership and a transition in France, what does that do to the Union's ability to address some near-term policy challenges that are actually quite pressing? I could think of two or three that will require resolution in the third or the fourth quarter. Brexit and the implementation of the protocol is one. The question around the fiscal framework, Christine has spoken about that will be a second. The third will be rule of law, what to do in particular, I think, with Hungary as Orbán trends into his election. And then the transatlantic alliance in light of what we've seen over the course of the last few weeks with the AUKUS deal. So I'll take those 3 points in turn. On weak German leadership, I think, look, the overall sense from the outside is you've got two candidates, they've run a terrible campaign, and the Chancellor who emerges, regardless of the identity, will be weaker. They'll be sitting on top of a much more fragmented coalition, 3 new parties in power, none of which have any real historical precedent of cooperating with each other in this situation, not recently at least. That will create more friction domestically. There'll be a need for more domestic politics, more coalition management, and all of those things will subtract from the new Chancellor's ability to lead in the EU. I think there's also a tendency to overestimate the extent to which these individuals actually understand Europe and its processes, the way it does things, and some of these policy challenges. I think that will arguably take much more time to really to figure out than building a coalition which could actually come together quite quickly. To what extent does Laschet really understand European policy process? Scholz perhaps a bit better because of his role as finance minister, but I think there is something of a gap in terms of knowledge at the European level about how things work. And I think that all will subtract from the leadership role Germany and the new Chancellor will likely be able to play in the short term. Now, that arguably will be exacerbated by, and this is my second point, the overall deficit of leadership in Europe as Macron transitions with his own election in the first half of next year. Now, I think, our sense is Macron will win the election. We have quite high conviction there, but he is vulnerable. That's something all incumbents, I think, are facing, which is a function of COVID and how uncertain the coronavirus pandemic is and how that will play out over the course of the remainder of this year. So Macron is vulnerable, not because he'll lose to Le Pen, but because there may be a credible centre-right challenger that knocks him out of the first round and prevents him getting into the runoff. So this means, I think, from the end of this year, really, all through the presidency that France will chair of the council in the first half of next year, Macron will be very much focused on his domestic political context. And the 2-round race takes place quite early. It's 10th and 24th of April, but I think people often forget there are legislative elections that happen in June. And so you don't really get the French system moving into a position of coherence until late summer. And then, of course, you need France and Germany with the new leaders and their respective mandates to get into a groove. So I think you've really got a transition in Germany, a transition in France. They're not synchronized, they don't overlap. And I think that does ultimately impact both France and Germany's ability to lead in Europe between now and certainly until the middle of next year. Now, that gap, that combination, I think from our perspective, then what we try to understand and analyze is how does that leadership deficit at the European level, these transitions, impact the union's ability to address some of these near-term policy challenges? And I'll talk about two more, Trod. First is the protocol and all of the issues around Brexit. I think our sense is the Article 16 risk is definitely underpriced, right? I think there's just an assumption that Boris Johnson and David Frost, they won't go there because going there does not resolve anything. The protocol remains. You stay within the framework of the protocol. It exacerbates legal and political uncertainty. You dig a deeper hole. But actually, I think when you think about the incentives and the motivations of some of the key characters in the UK, from the vantage point of domestic politics, triggering Article 16 actually makes much more sense. We have a Tory party conference on the 3rd of October. It would absolutely go down well with the base and the right of the party in that context. It would absolutely put Keir Starmer in a very difficult situation because his room for manoeuvre on Europe here in the UK is very, very limited. And so anything that forces him to articulate a slightly softer, more pro-EU approach is immediately used opportunistically by the Tories to really prevent Starmer being able to make inroads into the Red Wall, this coalition of voters he needs to win back in order to be competitive in 2023. It absolutely sticks it to the European Union and again challenges the EU legally and politically to respond. And there's a question as to whether the EU wants to be on the side of escalation. And so short-term, tactically and substantively, it absolutely serves the government's interest. Now, no matter who I talk to in Berlin, you get this very lazy response, which is almost, of course, we'll just delegate to the European Commission and they will lead the process. And there's no real thinking about the consequences of an Article 16 move by the UK government. Ultimately that could result in a trade war. There's no automaticity there, but the implications of triggering Article 16 in the process that then creates and catalyzes could ultimately result in trade retaliation. And to not really be thinking in a very meaningful or serious way about those issues at all, I find quite remarkable and quite interesting and perhaps quite telling. So that's one issue. I think that's a near-term risk. I don't think this is going to be something that plays out next year. I think Frost and Johnson are going to make a decision about what to do in the third and the fourth quarter. So as this coalition is either being stood up or indeed has just come to power, I think we'll have to address this. This will be a very near-term challenge. The next, and I'll just pick up really
perhaps briefly.
Very quickly. The next very quickly is just on the fiscal question, Waltrod. I think we're very worried, I think, that in building a coalition, the concessions offered to the FDP to do more domestically will come at the expense of flexibility at the European level. And I think there's a real risk that the recovery that is really taking hold is completely crashed as a result of re-implementation of a very austere fiscal framework in 2023. And the window to get resolution on this is basically between now and April, which we can talk more about in the Q&A. So that's something as well we're quite concerned about, and where you don't really have any coherence, I think, based on what we're hearing domestically, either from Scholz, Laschet, or the various coalition partners.
Thank you very much. So what I take from your contribution, Mitch, is to say, in a way, a German government, even if it wants continuity with respect to Brexit and the fiscal positioning in the European reform process and recovery process, will almost not be possible to be the same, especially because then also itself is not such a leading nation as it was before. Unless somebody wants very quickly respond to what another panelist has said, I think we should go straight to the Q&A because there's some really good questions there. Can I remind you that please put your affiliation, are you an LSE student, are you a journalist, whatever, into some names are recognized, of course. And you can also use the like function. Then a question, it has also already happened, comes on the top list, and I take them then first. That is your social media democracy for you. I'll take 3 questions that are at the moment on the top. The first is by Vladimir Djordjevic. I don't know who he is. And he says, Germany played an active role in the Balkans. Angela Merkel visited this region just before the end of her mandate. Can somebody assess whether the approach to the Balkans will change, especially in relation to the problem of Serbia and Kosovo? I would think Daniela or Ulrike have something to say to that about that. Then Samuel Huntington, surprisingly young, a student of ours, asks, would a traffic light coalition, for instance, be interested in taking a tougher line on misbehavior within the EU? Thinking, for example, of democratic backsliding in Eastern Europe. And then a question by Jonathan Siner. I was wondering how the future of Nord Stream 2 will look like. The Greens heavily articulate their objections regarding the projects. And as the Greens will be most likely part of the future government, will they give up on that position? Is there a possibility that Nord Stream 2 is shut down? Here, I think Mitch or Christian may want to come in. So first, the question on the Balkans, then one on democratic backsliding in Eastern Europe and how German governments respond to this. And then that old friend, Nord Stream 2, which is a really contentious issue inside the EU. Who would like to go first? Sorry, I have now.
Oh, I can give it a start in the order of the questions, if you like. So I'll pick the Western Balkans question and then briefly on democratic backsliding in the EU. So for the Western Balkans, first of all, no campaign issue at all. Very hard to really guess beyond the headline positions that we can see of the parties in let's say, public appearances, but nothing more longer programmatic. I think, everyone will subscribe to the ongoing negotiation processes. But I think depending on whom you then have in relevant positions, and for the enlargement process, it is obviously the Chancellery and then the Foreign Office. If we saw a green handwriting on that policy, I suppose because the Greens have I would say, sharper analytical view on how external influence plays in the EU, but also in its neighborhood and obviously the potential, the enlargement countries. I think maybe they will try and hold politically because the negotiations are in the EU's hands, but there's always also a bilateral relationship, try and hold leaders from the region more to account with regards to their openness and close proximity to Russia and China. And Serbia, of course, is a country that is on their radar. Then on the Berlin process, maybe, which I think is an important forum for dialogue with the Western Balkan countries. There is a concern, and I really do hope the new German government doesn't go that way, that this process could actually be handed over from the Berlin government, which in a way hosted the Berlin process continuously with partners, of course, that this could go to Brussels and the European Commission. I think that would be a mistake. It was really a Merkel project. So I would hope that any next chancellor would hold on to that dialogue forum, because if you give it to the Commission, then the stake that the member states, the EU member states have in the dialogue with the Western Balkans and the commitment that Germany would show would be less visible and may even be less important. And so I think it is very important to have this parallel track to the official EU negotiations led by the European Commission. On Serbia and Kosovo, there was, I don't think that any of the current candidates for either foreign ministry or the chancellery, in any way would try and push for the land swap idea, which, you know, has been seen as a risky endeavor when the idea came up from the German perspective. So I wouldn't expect a real policy change here. Let me briefly comment on backsliding democracy and whether the result of the German elections matters. I think it would. So one story that can be told about what does the EU do about it, you know, you can direct all eyes on Brussels and you say the processes sit there, the Article 7 procedures and the review of rule of law, which is now a regular report once a year, and then the Commission takes a position and the Council deals with it. Yes, all that is true. It is a Brussels-led process. But I would say the big mistake that Germany made over the past years was not to make this a also German political and bilateral topic with Viktor Orban in Hungary and with the peace government in Poland. In particular, in the case of Hungary, first of all, there's a huge asymmetry between both countries in terms of size, in terms of economic power, and in terms of economic interdependencies, because Hungary is a huge recipient of German FDI. So you could say there's a mutual dependence, yes, but I think had Germany very early on, when Viktor Orban started to implement the reforms, and this has been now more than a decade, essentially, since 2010, if Germany had been more vocal, more explicit, more critical, and maybe even sanctioning or threatening, not official EU sanctions, but sanctions coming out of the German attitude towards Hungary, maybe discouragement towards German companies that they were risking to work in an environment which doesn't fully respect rule of law principles. This would have been important signals. And it didn't happen. The theory seems to have been that
let's look forward, Daniela. So now you think a German government will have to become more hardline on this?
Yes, I think indeed. I think a new German government, frankly, no matter who is chancellor, can take a fresh start at it. If the Greens come in strongly into the government, there will be a difference in tone. And if there's an SPD chancellor, I would also think that the change of tone may be more important, but I would expect also a new CDU chancellor to be more explicit on those norms, not least to back up their own commissioner, also a CDU politician, Ursula von der Leyen.
Okay. Ulrike, do you want to say anything? There are quite a few questions for you, especially in the Q&A. So
yeah, I'll keep this super short because I just have literally just one kind of small nugget of information on the enlargement question, just because I find it interesting. So of all the parties, when you read all the party manifestos, which I had the pleasure of doing, something that really struck me, and that is how pro-EU enlargement the Greens are. Because the Greens basically not only are in favor of the enlargement towards the Western Balkan, which of course are already candidates, Turkey as well, but also they keep the door open for the EU-associated countries in the Eastern Partnership. So Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. And that struck me as quite interesting. Now, of course, you know, it's one party and it's just Germany as in one country within the EU 27, but just something that I wanted to add on the enlargement question.
Mm-hmm. Can I then ask either or both Christian and Mitch, what do you think about the whole Nord Stream issue? I mean, I think of Mitch because some would say that the gas crisis in Europe, and in particular in the UK, has also perhaps something to do with Nord Stream, because Gazprom seemed to have kind of shut down some of the deliveries through other channels in order to bring on the decision on authorizing the Nord Stream 2. And generally, will the Greens perhaps be, this is more to Christian, will the Greens be hardline on this carbon uplifting, investment that the Germans had with Russia, and it was such a foreign relations scandalizing issue for most. So who would like to start? Mitch?
I will, Waltraud, I'll happily start, but I will answer the question you directed to Christian on carbon taxes. And I'd also very briefly just like to comment on the Hungary-Poland issue, because I think this is quite important. It's it's not simply, I think, a course correction domestically in Germany, and I think we will see that. I agree with Daniela, regardless of Jamaica or Traffic Light Coalition. I think there is a perception that Merkel let this slide too long. But I think there's also massive pressure on von der Leyen from the European Parliament to begin to use some of the instruments that came together at the back end of last year to turn the screws on Orban and Kaczynski. And I think actually, in particular with Hungary, you're likely to see something of a distinction and a divergence. And I think really, as Daniela said, and I agree, I think things have gone so far there. And the last point I'll make on this is Orban's ejection from the EPP, I think, is absolutely important here and plays into this in a very material way, because when he was a part of the EPP, he had a lot of protection and influence from other centre-right parties in the EU. And I think the influence came from coordinating positions ahead of European councils, where he was at the table with all the other centre-right leaders. And the protection came from the fact nobody wanted to spotlight all the things Orban was doing because he was part of the same political family. Well, now he's on the outside. You see a kind of Brexit tendency to signal how different Orban is and how he's not like us. I think with that loss of protection and influence, Orban's also gone a bit more crazy domestically. He's got an election next year, and I think that will exacerbate and reinforce some of the hardening we're seeing in Berlin and Brussels to point to Budapest and make an example of them. So I think we see quite a high likelihood of short-term escalation between the two there. Just very, very quickly on carbon taxes, if I understood your question correctly, because this is something we're doing quite a lot of work on. There's a big question. I'll defer to Christian.
I don't think I asked about carbon taxes. It was about the Nord Stream 2 issue and whether that will be stopped because the Greens, for example, will be very hardline on this. Shall we pass that on to Christian?
Please do, yeah.
We come perhaps back to carbon taxes. Christian.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to quickly add one point on the Hungary and Poland issue. I'm not an expert on the rule of law, obviously, but when the recovery fund was published and the numbers flowing east, I was very surprised that the numbers are that high, that the formula were designed in a way that the east receives so much, and this is now a once in a lifetime opportunity to have proper economic leverage vis-a-vis these countries. And the fines that we can impose on the rule of law in terms of economics are minuscule compared to the recovery fund money that is held back by this. So I think it would be such a waste of this recovery fund money if we didn't toughen up on this issue. That's just the economist perspective on something I actually don't know that much about. On Nord Stream 2, I mean, this is, I think that ship has sailed, because the Greens would need to put an enormous amount of political bargaining chips to sort of torpedo this project. So I don't think there's a prospect that the Greens would do it. They are definitely unhappy with the completion or almost completion of that pipeline. And the gas crisis that is unfolding also in Europe, and will be an issue over the entire autumn and winter, I think plays into the hands of the critics and sort of make this Nord Stream 2 also a domestic embarrassment, which so far it wasn't really. It was a geopolitical issue, and sort of people realized that everybody is against it, but it was never, I felt, a politically toxic issue, in part because Merkel was backing it. And so I'm afraid that ship has sailed.
Ulrike seems to agree with you strongly. So let me take a few more questions because there's so much to take on. Fabian Musöfl, a colleague of mine at the European Institute, says, do you see in a way that Lindner plays in the hands of a red-green-red coalition? Because if they're not willing to soften their fiscal stance in face of gigantic investment needs, and I would add in parentheses, a very different idea about tax reforms than the SPD and the Green have, then the coalition talks of SPD, Greens and FDP, this traffic light coalition, will break down and then open the door to a red-green-red coalition. Does any of you see that as a likely dynamic of coalition negotiations? Then Alexander Karapiperis he asks, do you anticipate that there could be a shift in German foreign policy from its very transactional-based relationship with Turkey, with respect to, for example, money for refugees, to a more value-based approach, like the arms export embargo, or can these things go parallel? I would also then like Jakub Rogowiecki, who asks Ulrike specifically, given that the Greens will likely be necessary in government formation, with Annalena Baerbock being an outspoken critic of political actions taken by Russia and China, would you say that there could be some shift from overly pragmatic policy that Germany is known for towards one that confronts these powers? It would allow you to come back to this point that I also found quite interesting. In a way, you say there's an incoherent position to be, on the one hand, more hardline with respect to these big guys on the block, while at the same time, you don't want to invest in military capacities. So let's perhaps take these questions. First, coalitions with respect to does that go to, is there a chance for a red-green-red coalition? Does the SPD and the Green signal a change in the Turkey policy? And then the question of, for Ulrike, about the policy stance towards Russia and China. Can I ask first on the FDP, because Christian, you had already started this, Christian, and
yeah, absolutely. So I think you could tell with the rise of Olaf Scholz, you could also see Christian Lindner's rhetoric changing a bit, basically saying, so the black zero, which we call is our name for the balanced budget, the black zero fetish was never mine, but the CDU's, which I thought was a smart sentence and sort of placing himself in that spectrum. But he's relatively clear on adherence to the debt brake. But he's smart in not excluding some of the other options that, conservatives would say circumvent the debt brake, but I would say make creative use of the debt brake. And so I think there is willingness by the FDP. That my sense is not entirely clear from the party platform of how far they are willing to go. I mean, the FDP's party platform on fiscal matters was almost unserious in a way, right? They were proposing tax cuts and were saying that they want to maintain the debt brake at the same time, where even, I would say, sort of centrist / conservative leading economic research institutes were saying, sorry, that math, even with the most generous assumptions, is never going to work. And so, it's not clear if it's how far they are willing to go. I think the red-green-red coalition on economic grounds, the left party has moderated on that account as well. And the demands of the left party are somewhat a more socialist version of the SPD and the Green platform. So, for example, the Social Democrats want €12 minimum wage and the left party wants 13. Surely there's some room for compromise, and some of the other economic issues are similar, that there is clearly room for compromise. So the decision on the red-green-red coalition is really on security and foreign policy issues and not on economic issues. Yeah. And I think the left party has moderated enough for it to be a credible last resort threat. And this is exactly what the SPD and the Greens need.
Mitch and Ulrike, you can say something on this. Why don't we go then directly to the question that was also directed at you, and you can add something to this FDP, which I had the impression you want to.
Right. Yeah. So just the red-green-red coalition question, because that's SPD, Greens, and Die Linke party. Quite honestly, that would be quite a catastrophic outcome from a foreign and defense policy viewpoint. And that's not just my view. It is my view, but that's also pretty much the view of almost all, I would say, German partners and allies. So I think that's, from a foreign policy point of view, that's quite striking. And the reason for that is that the Linke really has foreign policy positions that are quite out there. So just to name a few, they want to dissolve or at least leave NATO and create a security alliance with Russia. They are against all German military operations abroad, including those, for example, in the Baltics to support the NATO partners in the Baltics. Interestingly enough, though, I mean, first of all, I think this coalition...
would almost agree with Biden on this these days, no?
Say again?
Gysi and Biden are very close these days on this.
Well, what's interesting, though, is, I mean, this coalition is quite unlikely to begin with, though not impossible, which is interesting in and of itself. But, you know, if this coalition happens, I'm going to spend the next 4 years reminding the Linke that in their party program, they quite literally have the sentence saying, we will not be part of any government that spends more on the military, sends any kind of soldiers abroad, and, you know, generally does what German foreign policy does. So quite interesting and quite striking. On the questions that were directed to me, I have to admit, I love the assumptions, because both of these questions, one was speaking about a transactional policy towards Turkey, and the other was speaking about an overly pragmatic German relationship with Russia. And I find these assumptions very interesting, because I don't think that German foreign policymakers would see their foreign policy making in this light. And I also don't quite think that that's what they were going for. Of course, you know, all over the world, there's always this question between values and interests. And of course, you know, I'm not saying, you know, Germany has a fully values-based foreign policy, but it is definitely trying to have that. So I don't think that, you know, Germany actually has an overly pragmatic or transactional policy to anyone, I want to say. Would this change with the Greens in government? In theory, yes. It is true that the Greens, I mean, not only do they emphasize human rights more and values, they actually want Germany to adopt a feminist foreign policy. So that's quite new in the German political realm. And so they definitely put kind of different foci in the German foreign policy. That being said, we will, in all likelihood, see a three-party coalition. And there's always the question of, like, who gets the relevant ministries, namely the Foreign Office and the Defense Office. And so I think these two elements will mean that any position, whether it's the Greens or the FDP's or anyone's positions, will end up being watered down. So even if we get a government with the Greens in it, even if it is, you know, SPD-led with the Greens, I don't think we're going to see a huge shift from a maybe slightly more pragmatic to a more values-based or feminist foreign policy, as has been implied here. Maybe a little bit, but I think it's going to get watered down in the end.
Can I ask, I think Turkey is an important case that we haven't discussed so far. Could I ask both Mitch and Daniela perhaps say something on whether you think the Merkel tightrope walk with respect to Turkey is not feasible, arguably, for a long time anymore now with perhaps Afghan humanitarian migration. What changes do you expect, or what does the world expect from Germany to change there? Mitch, do you want to start?
I'll say very few words on Turkey, Valtrad, and then I'll defer to Daniela to talk about the difference in policy from various coalition options vis-a-vis Turkey. Look, I think structurally the problem is Erdogan is here and he's not going anywhere. If you look today, the central bank was forced to cut the interest rate by 100 basis points, which came as a complete surprise. And I think inflation is close to 19.5%, 20%. You know, he's always 2 steps away from a full-on balance of payments crisis. And this is in the context of him running into an election in 2023. And I just think structurally, the economy and the interaction of what's happening with the economy always drives a lot of foreign policy adventurism for Erdogan when it's convenient for him to do so, when he needs to distract the attention of his voters. So perhaps there will be a softer position from Germany in light of the need to cooperate over refugees from Afghanistan. But structurally, Erdogan and the economy are going to remain a big problem. And I think that's going to drive a lot of the problem and a lot of the friction we've seen historically.
Thank you. Daniela, is there anything you would like to say about Turkey and the approach to it?
Well, yes, I think with a real dose of realism. So there are constraints, let's put it that way, on any German government's Turkey policy, and that is the Turkish population in Germany or those of Turkish origin in Germany, of whom more than within Turkey are supporters of Erdogan. And so this is something, where the external relationship with Turkey at a moment in time where there are more and more reports to what extent Turkey also intervenes in the German electoral campaign, really. I think it is, on the one hand, of course, one wants to push back and wants to be critical, but on the other hand, that German citizens of Turkish origin plus Turkish citizens living in Germany are critical of a policy that takes a harder line on Erdogan. That's one thing. Second thing is alternatives to the migration deals that have been struck. Frankly, very hard to think of, to do away with them entirely. What I would think a government which would have a strong green participation, what they would do, they would probably be more alert to the question of human rights violations within Turkey, not only vis-a-vis refugees, but also, within Turkey, the suppression of free media and so on. So there I would think there would be a more critical tone. But on the question, is it conceivable that the next German government does away with a migration deal, which, by the way, is not a German-Turkish deal, of course, but it's a really European deal, at a time where we actually move towards a phase where there will be an argument to strike more and with other governments because of the situation in Afghanistan. My realism tells me I don't think there will be a substantive change. At the moment, Turkey, with whom the EU officially, never ended the negotiations, although they are de facto stalled for a long time, I don't think any government would push right now for new dynamics in this, simply because the situation in Turkey does not lend itself to this. It hasn't become better over the past month and years. It has become, obviously, with regards to European norms, it has become worse. And so, I think there's this, double-edged sword. To some extent, we need deals and good treatment of migrants in the country. So it's not just any deal that the next German government will look into. And then there is, of course, a list of conflictual issues with regards to human rights and civil liberties and so on.
Now I have from my friend and colleague Matthias Matthijs, a professor at SAIS in Washington, a very good question, of course. If the polls are correct, then there have been remarkable the Greens, the SPD and the FDP will gain votes compared to 2017, while the center-right CDU-CSU will lose a substantial share of voters, and the extreme right AfD and the extreme left Die Linke also lose. Does anyone have a good explanation for why Germany is defying the continent-wide trend that favors right-wing populism? Then I have a question from Economics and Politics 6th form student who says, I have heard lots of talks around an EU defense army, something that Macron himself appears to be championing. How feasible is such a thing? If possible, would it be seen as a threat to Russia and cause more tension as well, as the USA seems to be displeased by such a concept? What part would Germany play in EU defense, especially since they usually take the lead over much of Europe, just not in military? And finally, a question from Pia Günther. She says, I'm wondering what Germany's future will look like in terms of being able to compete economically if we would go totally green, implement strategies of degrowth. Considering these factors, for example, China, then the actor on the height of its growth and power, still catching up. Germany, what would happen to its export power in the car industry, energy transition, and then Germany limiting transnational corporations to make them climate conform and would lose out as an attractive location for TNCs. So she's skeptical that one can give the Greens a big say in this coalition. Can I ask so somebody to have a view of this trend, Germany backing the trend that the right-wing populism does not win in Germany, and if anything, it's a bit of center-left strengthening right now. And then a question about defense capability that the French wants, and finally the degrowth strategy and the Greens. Is that actually really feasible? The last one, perhaps again to whoever wants to say that. So can I ask who volunteers for something? Ulrike, you have your hand.
I love to volunteer for these questions. So first of all, very briefly on the right-wing populism. I mean, it is true that the AfD, that 4 years ago, we were really talking a lot about the AfD, and there was a real worry that right-wing populism could become a really strong force in German politics. That didn't quite materialize, but number one, they still poll at, I don't know, I haven't seen the latest numbers, but 11% or something like that, which honestly is, I believe, is too much. And importantly, this national number hides the numbers from some German Bundesländer, especially in the East, where the AfD may end up being the strongest party in this election. And that's really concerning. So a bit of a caveat on have we really managed to overcome this or not fall into this trap. Still, it is true that, they're not polling at 20 or 30%. And I think there are kind of three main reasons for this. Number one, I mean, the German history has kind of taught, if the German history has taught one thing to the German population, is that right-wing populists are bad news. And luckily, most Germans still realize this. Number two, the AfD didn't manage to benefit or motivate the kind of anti-vaccination crowd in Germany as much. Maybe it wasn't strong enough. It just didn't quite manage to do that. And number three, climate change was a huge topic in this election, and really, I think, impacted a lot of voting decisions. And the AfD, I mean, they're kind of almost adopting this "we don't quite believe in human-made climate change" position, which a lot of right-wing parties do, and this just doesn't fly in Germany. I mean, pretty much no one believes that, so that didn't quite work. But the real question I want to take out is about the European army, because I was kind of waiting for that one, because it always comes. So I have to say, so number one, Germany doesn't lead on European defense. We ran a poll at ECFR recently where we asked EU member states in which areas Germany could lead. And they gave pretty high marks for human rights. They gave pretty high marks for kind of economic and fiscal topics. They gave really low marks for all the kind of geopolitical questions, so China, etc. 27%, which I thought was way too much, of Europeans thought that Germany could lead on defense, but it's only 27%. And again, I think this is too much, and even Germans didn't quite believe this. I think they said 20%. So I really don't think that Germany can lead on European defense, simply because Germany has a rather tricky relationship with defense and military in the first place. And the reason why it likes European defense and the idea of the European army is because it sees this as a way of unifying Europe more, and almost as a way of getting rid of all these nasty military questions at the national level and putting it at the European level. So it's not really focused at real capabilities. I must admit, it is really quite striking that I think the four center parties, if you want to call it like this, or the four leading parties, so CDU, SPD, FDP, and Greens, they all have the European army in their party manifesto, which I find rather frustrating. But yeah, it's definitely still an idea that's kind of floating around in Europe. Why do I think it's not going to be an idea that's in any way kind of useful? Well, the main reason is that the European army, quite honestly, should come after the United States of Europe and not before. Anything, if you do the European army before the United States of Europe, you basically put the carriage before the horse. You can't have joined armed forces if you don't have a completely integrated foreign policy, but just any kinds of policy areas. So for me, this is one of those things that kind of sounds good, but it's not going to materialize. The Europeans are not going to give up their armed forces. And if the idea is not to do that, but rather to create a kind of 28 army for the EU, then I would love to know, A, where does the money come from? Because we're clearly not spending enough for that. And then 2, who kind of commands such an army? And either it's by unanimous decision and we're never going to use it, or it's by majority decision, and I really can't see this. So, yeah, so I'm afraid that I have to crush any hopes of a European army.
I think I have to stop you there. You will never make it for an invitation with Macron for tea in that way. Can I ask?
No. I disagree on that. No, but really, because Macron is not in favor of the European army. I don't want to capitalize on that, but this is really an incorrect understanding.
Okay. Degrowth strategy. Christian, is that really such a terrible idea for Germany's attractiveness and economic potential itself?
So there is no degrowth strategy, full stop. So this is because it is politically a complete non-starter, and this is why just the fringes of the Green Party are actually advocating it. But what is important is sort of how do you couple an industrial export nation with an ambitious climate change agenda? And that is a very important question. That is one of the questions that I think is this is not at the heart of every party platform, but it is of serious concern of every party and every party's platform. And I think one of the striking indications there is that, for example, the left party, that would not be known to being extremely industry friendly, has in its party platform a 20 billion a year transformation fund for the industry, just to help with that transition, right? So that shows you that even the leftist fringe is willing to spend 20 billion a year in helping industry make that transformation, and the other parties will just be the same. So we will see, and this is also why the industry is pushing for sort of ditching the black zero. We will see a very strong push by all German parties, regardless of who's in government, to make sure that German industry, including the entire supply chain, survives the transition to climate change. And one of the indications that I find a bit worrying in that regard is that there is a very strong push for a hydrogen economy, even though sort of the science on hydrogen as an important part of that strategy is not as clear cut as sort of some of the proponents are saying. This is to say, sort of the lobbying is really tough to make that happen. Whether Germany will be a leader on this and to make it even more problematic for the German economic model than for others, I'm not sure. I mean, most of the climate agenda is done at the European level, and the climate targets are set at the European level. I think one of the crucial questions will be, can we agree with the United States on either a carbon border adjustment mechanism or some form of a climate club? And this is where I think the conservative parties are a bit more skeptical, and the progressive parties are a bit more forceful in trying to push that. That will be sort of what I will be watching when it comes to this question of whether the German model, the export model, can thrive in a sort of climate ambitious political environment.
Mitch, can I bring you in there, because you earlier wanted to talk about the carbon tax? I mean, one way, instead of doing, even I take the point of Christian that probably there is not such a strong growth strategy as Pia may have thought. But if you want to go green, you can always say, let's Europeanize it. Then at least we don't have a competitive disadvantage relative to our major trade partners. Where are we with the carbon tax? And do you think the new government will be a force for that? And to Daniela, I would later like to come back with this question by Matthias Matthijs about why does Germany buck the trend?
So, Lothar, this is actually one area where I think the difference between Laschet and Scholz could actually be quite important and quite substantive. And the reason is there's a big, I think, philosophical difference between Paris and Berlin about how to implement the carbon tax, not necessarily on the design or the details of the design. There are some differences there, and the legislation will go through trialogue now, I think, through most of next year. But in terms of how you use the tax, is it purely a nuclear deterrent that you can have in your back pocket as leverage to get other big emitters to the table and begin to match EU climate ambition, or do you actually implement the thing? And if you do implement it, do you do that unilaterally or as part of a collective? And I think Christian's point, I think that the view, I think, within the German system has been, we've got to do this multilaterally. And of course, in the Elysee, I think around Macron and the French, I think, are much more willing to go unilateral and do this unilaterally. And I think, you know, one very important and deterministic signpost will be COP and the commitments we see from some of the big emitters in that context, and then try to see how that then maps onto the internal debate within Europe. I think Lachette, and, you know, especially if you have a Merz anywhere near an economy or finance ministry, will definitely try to dilute any idea of unilateral implementation. I think this is perhaps something Scholz and the Greens in a traffic light context may lean into a bit more, but COP will be very important, I think, for the EU debate that follows.
Daniela, can I ask you, do you have a good explanation for why Germany, if anything, there is now a strengthening a little bit of the left of center party groupings?
Well, I think, you know, the question was I think Matthias put it more particularly on the AfD, and I think the performance of the party. Now, they have spent 4 years in our parliament as the largest opposition party, which means they have held important posts, which by definition goes to the largest opposition party, such as chair of the budgetary committee and other things. And their performance in those jobs, plus their way of using parliamentary procedures to actually to slow down parliamentary processes, to extend meetings, to, you know, have sessions run into Friday afternoons because they are actually hindering progress. That is something not only playing out in the German federal parliament, but it also plays out in regional parliaments and elsewhere where they sit. This obstruction of the system. This is something that really is not seen positively. It's their way of showing their dissent, obviously, with the system, but this is nothing that gets any support. Then comes the COVID-19 crisis and the climate crisis. Ulrike has mentioned both. I think that is really important, that you have people who seriously argue on primetime TV that neither exists and nothing needs to be done, and you know, spreading all kinds of conspiracy theory. Third element, the awareness of external interference in domestic politics, campaigns, broader public has grown, and one vector of influence is the AfD. You know, there is a very, you know, close and even articulated proximity with Russia. Meetings have come, you know, known to the public where AfD leaders met with Bannon, so really the advisor of Trump, who also advised other far-right populists around Europe in their work, and all of this has really created a very bad image of the party, which is under surveillance now by the intelligence services in Germany. So it still has a voter potential of about 11 to 12%. There were fears that this could go higher, up to 15, but I think really their behavior in the crisis may have solidified their followership. So those who wish to follow conspiracy theories, who wish to buy into that narrative, they will more firmly feel this is my political home. But others who were sort of looking at the party and thinking, oh, well, maybe it's not really radical, it's not far-right extremist, they have seen a lot over the past years that has to make them think, oh, wow, this is a party which is really on the political fringes, and where some people, even in the party leadership group, do adopt extremist positions.
Mm-hmm. I take a few other questions. There are some that seems to overlap a bit, but one is about leadership that earlier, and in particular, Mitch has problematized that a lot. And Stefan Collignon says something that I actually also have heard in recent interviews with top officials in Brussels. Christian, you said Merkel pushed the recovery fund. What was that they're not really Scholz in the finance ministry, which would say a lot about what we could expect if he became chancellor. So Stefan Collignon, a former colleague of ours and a visiting fellow at the European Institute. Then Martin Fischer, a political economy student of last year. He asks, what will be the impact of the German election on economic and financial integration within the EU? For instance, what will be the outcome of the election with respect to the European deposit insurance, for which a legislative proposal is planned by the end of this year? Will the CDU-CSU-led government oppose this? And then I take a new question below, which is also, I think, a very important question, and I have lost who said it, but it is about the relationship between Germany and Africa. And, this is not the closest continent to Germany in its geopolitical interests, but we all know it can become one speed through humanitarian migration or simply through the sheer potential for misery that develops when we, for example, don't share vaccination and so on. What do you expect from a German new government with respect to Africa? So can I briefly have Scholz's role in the whole previous reforms, the prospect of economic reforms that Martin Fischer asked for, and then this big question about Africa.
So let me just quickly say on Scholz and Merkel. Yes, so Scholz's finance ministry is sort of formally in charge of the design of these things. So it's mainly, built in the finance ministry. But so I was one of those who wrote pieces about this at the time, sort of what should be done. And when we were writing our piece, we put this legal basis that they used, sort of the European Treaty and Solidarity Clause. We argued for common EU debt, but at the time we thought, well, let's be bold. Let's ask for 400 billion, right? And so we thought we were really, really bold. And we didn't expect EU governments to agree to increasing the EU budget to pay for it. We always thought national guarantees would still be necessary. But, EU governments went above and beyond that. So this is just to say, even a long-term observer of this like me was surprised by how bold this was. And this cannot be done by the finance minister alone, right? So just as one example of why I think Merkel was sort of the one who pushed this, or who was chiefly responsible for this. She had spoken to all 26 heads of state and, got at least their sort of tacit approval, if not consent. She has made sure that nothing of that was leaked to the press before it would get published. She got her own parliamentary group to publish a press statement in support 10 minutes after this thing went public, which means she had briefed and secured the support of her parliamentary group without any leaks to them. So this means just how much political capital Merkel has put into this. So, architect of the house, yes, but the one commissioning that house was Merkel. On the reforms, European deposit insurance is a good example for where Scholz's thinking is. He published a piece in the finance ministry in the end of 2019 on sort of where he sees the banking union to proceed. It was a sort of a progress, stepwise, German pace, but still, progress in that direction. And I know on these things, the finance ministry thinks progressively in that sense. So European, very European. So I would expect a Scholz chancellor to be taking interest in these dossiers because he was interested in bringing this forward. But the opposition, of course, is fierce, and governing against the CDU opposition is a tough job. So I wouldn't expect him to sort of be extremely bold on these issues because you have sort of German local banks, savings banks, all against you. So it's a sort of, stepwise process. But nothing revolutionary in that sense.
Mitch, do I see you itching, saying something on that question?
Just very quickly, Walter, I think, we can navel gaze about deposit insurance and banking union, but it's not really the issue. The big question is, will Mario Draghi's performance in Italy build enough confidence in Northern Europe to have a conversation about making the recovery fund permanent? And if that's unlikely, and I think it's unlikely given all the signals we're getting from Germany, will what Mario Draghi does in Italy and Macron in France create space for a meaningful conversation over reform of the fiscal framework? Because that's 2023. And the negotiation for that really begins in earnest when the Commission kicks off the general review of the SGP, at some point in the next few weeks. And that's a question that needs to be resolved in the first quarter. And if it's not resolved, yes, through the crisis, Europe did a lot of unprecedented spending, but it will again be forced into unprecedented tightening in a year from now. So I think that's really the two big political questions down the track are Stability and Growth Pact and fiscal space and Recovery Fund permanence. I think the banking union stuff is on a much slower timetable and a lot less, it's structurally important, but a lot less short-term consequential compared to these other two issues.
It's a really big question. Sorry, guys, but I give, of course, to our two female panelists. The relationship with Africa that Bakar Debele, the president of the Ethiopian Public Administration Association, has asked. Do you see any changes there? Is there anything that was a bit left behind by the Merkel administration? We go slightly over time, but we close soon. I look through the questions, but there's something we really haven't addressed and it's very important. So, Daniela, would you like to go first? And then we'll go to Ulrike.
Yes, I'll be very short because of time. So yes, the current German government hasn't been very active on Africa, though increasingly so compared to previous governments. But the point is that Germany, in my view, can't say of itself that it has a coherent Africa strategy and that it knows exactly where it is and why it is there. And which means are most appropriate. So if you look at, for instance, military presence in Africa, and you look at Mali, you will find very few parliamentarians in Berlin who have actually voted for this mission, who exactly know why we are there, if it is not because we are there with the French. So I'm quoting this as an example to make the point that both in terms of security, fight against terrorism, but also for reasons of development and humanitarian aid. I think the next German government will have to look at Africa far more holistically. And just a final little example to show you where we are currently, there is a broad perception that also the think tank sphere in Berlin isn't equipped for the challenge. So very recently in the federal budget, we could find a budget line to create a new Africa Institute, which speaks to the fact that the existing think tanks never really invested enough in capacity to have Africa teams that are strong enough to advise. So this will be an important addition. But I'll hand it over to Ulrike.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add the following. I mean, foreign policy wasn't really a topic in this political campaign. Mm-hmm. Even Europe and the EU wasn't really a topic, which Germans tend to care about quite a bit. In the 3 TV triels that we had, we basically didn't talk about any of this, and this despite the fact that while the campaign was going on, we had the Afghanistan withdrawal and everything that came with this, and the AUKUS new alliance. And I'm not going to call it debacle, but I mean, let's say the kind of quarrel over the AUKUS alliance and the submarine deal. So this is to say that, given all of this, Africa certainly wasn't a topic. And even worse, if you like, it's also not really a topic in the party manifestos, which together amount to over 1,000 pages. So yeah, I'm with Daniela insofar as I don't think the think tank community is equipped. I don't really think that the political community is really equipped with this. So I can't tell you where we're going with this, but I can't see any kind of new vision emerging. Or if it is, they're really keeping it under wraps.
Okay. A last question was given to me by a questioner, Nihal Ahadin, and I would like to go in reverse order. What is Merkel's legacy? You think? What is the most important, one important legacy that she left? Mitch, you're first.
I think it's the Recovery Fund, Waltraud, and what that potentially has done for euro area sustainability over the medium to long term.
Thank you. Daniela.
If she uses the next 3 days to say, and it should be a permanent feature of the EU, I would fully agree, Mitch. My worry is that it will be pulled down again. But no, you're right. This was a very bold move. I slightly disagree with Christian that I do think Scholz had a lot of convincing to do to get where they ended up. But I think it's, the most important and boldest move that there was.
Christian.
Well, I wanted to say the same. So do I have to find something new? I think one of the things in response to the question on right-wing populism, what I always valued and what I think is sort of is part of her legacy as well as a style issue, sort of to make politics less divisive and a complete refusal to play any culture war games, which must be tempting to politicians on the conservative right when there are issues like migration and refugees and so forth. Her refusal to do that and set the tone and stick with it, and wait it out until even the CSU turned migration positive. I think that sets the tone, I hope, for the next few chances as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'd say the legacy of Merkel is one of stability, and she helped make sure that Germany and the EU made it through stormy waters. She managed, but she didn't lead, which is why I find all these questions about, who will now lead the EU slightly misleading, because I don't quite feel that Germany or Merkel did that.
If I may give my answer, I think what Merkel actually showed, and it's slightly in contradiction to Ulrike, is that German politics can actually change quite rapidly, quite quickly. She had 3 big U-turns on nuclear energy, on migration, and then on the fiscal integration side of the EU. That is a legacy where one would think, well, what's next? What can Germany change quickly and then reset some parameters of the debate? Whether the next one will do it, I'm not sure, but it is also that Germany is either less stable or less reliable, however you want to interpret that. Without further ado, thank you all very much for an excellent discussion, wonderful questions that made it so much easier for me because I didn't have all these good questions. Thank you very much.